The story is often told of the little boy. Offering plate was about to be passed again, and he felt bad every Sunday because he never had anything to give. His family didn't go to church with him. And finally, one Sunday, he couldn't control himself. And as the usher stood up to say the prayer, he took out the envelope. He took out the pencil that was in the pew rack, and he just wrote, "All of me." And he put it in the offering plate when it was passed. And that's a powerful picture of really what giving's about. And anytime you're in a giving or a generosity campaign, there's sometimes those awkward moments, and I'm trying to avoid them because my emphasis, I believe, is what Paul's emphasis is when it comes to 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. And that is, like he said, the Macedonians, they first gave themselves to the Lord. And if we get that right, then really I'm not concerned about the dollars and the cents and all that comes in, because our wallet follows our heart. And so this week, these 5 weeks, we're going to be talking a lot more about our hearts than any bank account or any checkbook, if they still exist, or any of those other forms of giving. If you came in today and you have not been here the last couple weeks and you did not get a book, would you just raise your hand up real quick? These are free. And so it's not like a program. Or, I went to see Apollo 8 the other day at 80 players. It's not like a playbill. But we just want you to get a copy of this, and this is yours to keep. And kind of unusual is we want you to bring it with you to worship and to community group, because there'll be some lessons in there that we're doing all together with our 3 campuses and our 6 different congregations. If you have your Bibles, I'm going to ask you to find 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And then chapter 9, we'll cross over into chapter 9. And that's going to be our focus. This is the third of our 5 messages. Again, 2 weeks ago, we looked at chapter 8, I believe verse 5, which says, "And first they gave themselves to the Lord." Last week, Pastor Kirby stood here. He talked about giving sacrificially, again, as it spoke of those Macedonian Christians. And again, I don't assume that in your mind you have all of this geography. So let me just take a moment, again, to frame 2 Corinthians. You have northern Greece. All of this is Greece. Northern Greece is a section called Macedonia. Cities you may recognize: Philippi, Thessalonica, now it's called Thessaloniki, Berea. All of these are in Macedonia. Paul is in Macedonia. And Titus has just returned from Corinth, having delivered 1 Corinthians, that's what we call it, and they had responded well. So Paul receives Titus happy that they took his instruction, because 1 Corinthians has some pretty pointed statements in there about failures that they'd made. And now Paul is writing a second letter to Corinth, which is in Achaia. That's kind of south and western part of Greece. And we're going to see in today's passage, he's sending 2 Corinthians this letter with a reminder about the collection that they're going to take. Macedonia already took their collection, and though they were impoverished, I believe it's the 4th verse of this chapter, says they begged so that they could give to help the church in Jerusalem. So that's the context. And so when we listen to the names and the people being sent, we know that they're about to take this letter we call 2 Corinthians. Now, again, the focus this week is going to be more on the integrity of the giver as well as the leader. And so I want our focus to be there as well. So the title this morning is Leading with Integrity. Again, if you haven't found it, 2 Corinthians, so you have the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Romans, Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. And I'll begin by reading these 14 verses, starting with verse 16. So Paul continues, "But thanks be to God, who puts the same earnestness on your behalf in the heart of Titus. For he has not only accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest, he has gone to you of his own accord. We have sent along with him the brother whose fame in the things of the gospel has spread through all the churches. And not only this, but he has also been appointed by the churches to travel with us in this gracious work, which is being administered by us for the glory of the Lord himself, and to show our readiness, taking precaution so that no one will discredit us in our administration of this generous gift. For we have regard for what is honorable, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. We have sent with them our brother, whom we have often tested and found diligent in many things, but now even more diligent because of his great confidence in you. As for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker among you. As for our brethren, they are messengers of the churches, a glory to Christ. Therefore, openly before the churches, show them the proof of your love and of our reason for boasting about you." Continue chapter 9. "For it is superfluous for me to write to you about this ministry to the saints. For I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the Macedonians, namely that Achaia has been prepared since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. But I've sent the brethren in order that our boasting about you may not be made empty in this case, so that, as I was saying, you may be prepared. Otherwise, if any Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to speak of you, will be put to shame by this confidence. So I thought it necessary to urge the brethren that they would go on ahead of you and arrange beforehand your previously promised bountiful gift, so that the same would be ready as a bountiful gift and not affected by covetousness. All right, so again, I believe the context tells us quite a bit about this interchange and what is happening. And we see two distinct groups, and we're going to see Paul puts his trust in his leaders, his envoys, his ambassadors, those he will send. And then he also puts his trust in the Corinthian believers, which we'll get to in just a moment. Again, did you hear three different individuals are referenced in the last few verses of chapter 8? And it's interesting because one is named and two are not. And so that's always intriguing. What does this mean? Well, let's look at the named one, verse 16. He speaks of Titus. You might recognize that name. There's a letter in the Bible to Titus that he received when he was pastoring on the island of Crete. And so we know Titus. He was a Gentile. He was a Greek. Unlike Timothy, who had a Jewish mother, he had both Gentile mother and father. Whereas Timothy was compelled to be circumcised, Titus was not. And so we know Titus traveled with Paul on his third missionary journey. He served in Crete. He was with Paul when Paul was imprisoned in Rome. He's mentioned there. And in Paul's last letter, 2 Timothy, he is sent to the coast of Dalmatia, which is current-day Serbia, there on the coast, that part of Europe. And so we know quite a bit about Titus. He'd just been to Corinth. He delivered 1 Corinthians. He'd come to Macedonia, and he's about to go back. And so there's more interest. Well, who are the other two? Verse 18, it speaks about this famous brother. Now, again, as you can imagine, speculation runs rampant. I found at least 10. I quit looking after that point. Scholars speculate, well, it could be this one or that one. The two most prominent guesses, or it could be Luke, or it could be Apollos. It could be neither. But those are the two that are kind of held up that is probable. And there's actually a third brother, often also not named, verse 22. It says we've sent with them, with these first two, our brother, again, not named. The way I treat such passages, if it were that important, God would have told us. So what we need to understand is these three church leaders, fairly high profile, are being sent by Paul from northern Greece, from Macedonia, we don't know which city up there, to Achaia, to the city of Corinth, to deliver this letter and also to encourage them to follow through. The year before, they'd already said that they're going to take up an offering to help the church in Jerusalem. So that's part of the assignment. And so Paul is writing to them to say, this is the generosity that I applaud in you, and it is an example to others. Again, I hate to admit that, being a pastor up here, a minister, that even in my lifetime as a child, I mean, you could always trust the pastor. The pastor was right up there, I guess with police or whomever served the community. If the pastor said it was true, and you never doubted the pastor was going to be faithful to his wife and all of those things. And I wish I could say it's the same today, but unfortunately it's not. And I came across some kind of disturbing surveys back in 1985. 67% of those who were surveyed said that ministers have a high or very high honesty or ethical standard. 67%. Last year, that same survey was taken, and we dropped, some surveys said 39%, and some said 40%. Now, again, always look for a silver lining. We rated higher than the members of Congress, which was a good thing, but we were just below funeral directors, so I'm not sure where to really take that. But I understand, and I'm not here to argue against it. It is sad that every month, if not every week, we see a high-profile minister, pastor, whatever, usually at a mega church or prominent church, that falters. And the big three ways to falter, they haven't changed in my lifetime. Sex, greed, and pride. Just over and over when you see it happen. And I believe pride actually bleeds into the first two. It becomes where a pastor, especially some of these huge churches, they begin to think they're above the law. They're above God's revealed will. That God's going to make an exception for them because they're so valuable to his kingdom. and they lose perspective if, in fact, they ever had it. And so, again, I don't stand before you demanding any authority, except my authority comes from this word. And so when I speak truth, I have authority. And if I don't speak or live truth, then I must be held accountable just as anyone else must be held accountable. Again, if you received the book today or you remember to bring it back, I'm going to refer to page 94. And again, all of our campuses are working through this. So these are just notes that you can review later. And from this passage, the end of chapter 8, it talks about how leaders must demonstrate integrity and trust with God's resources by employing, and if you want to jot down in there, good planning, transparency, and uprightness. Good planning, transparency, and uprightness. Now, if you have lived a few more years than others, then I'm sure you have observed the lives of many different pastors or ministers. And they're probably all over the scale. As a youth pastor, I served with 4 different pastors, and 3 of them taught me immensely what not to do as a pastor. I mean, that was their life. When I watched them, I thought, oh my goodness, I was all of 18 years old. And I thought, I have more sense than that. Why would he do that? 2 of them left the ministry, which was actually a good thing for the ministry. And so I saw, unfortunately, some of the worst examples of pastors, people who would say something from the pulpit and do just the opposite when they step down from the platform. And I assume that you've seen all across the spectrum. I hope you've seen many godly men and marriages that were a good example and are a good example of what it means to follow the Lord. A few years ago, when I was asked to lead all of Europe, I was bringing Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe together, and so it was 2 different leadership teams. And so I had everyone read the book, Speed of Trust, which Stephen Covey Jr. wrote. It's not a Christian book, but I believe it has a good point. And the point is, 2 things are essential for trust: character and competency. See, a lot of times in the church, we just want to say character's enough. And then if the pastor's lazy or doesn't invest in time of study or doesn't get out to visit or doesn't do those things, people will say, well, he's a good guy. You know, he's nice to his wife. He loves the Lord. And so character is a non-negotiable, but so is competency. It's that as we're talking about bringing the tithes to the storehouse, we're talking about generosity campaign, we need to know that our leadership is going to lead wisely, that there needs to be competency, that there needs to be good planning. And I believe our structure is good with executive council, with deacon bodies, with finance committees, with personnel committee, different things that are giving input. So it's not in the hands of 1 or 2 that may take a direction that would not be called good planning or transparency. Again, good planning, I think of our Lord many times said, you count the cost before you build a house, before you take an army into battle. In fact, the small town I pastored, Celeste, Texas, I remember there was a family that moved there. They were foreigners. I mean, they were like a different county than Hunt County, where Celeste was. And they moved in and they were building a 2-story house, which in that town was pretty unusual. And I visited them. They weren't interested in the Lord. But again, a small town, you can circle back every 3 months or so to visit, check. And after about 2 years, I visited them, and he said, well, Pastor, we're about to leave. I said, well, what happened? He said, well, I lost my job 3 or 4 months ago. And I can't finish the house. It was 95% finished, but they never bought the land. All the money invested in this house, and it belongs to somebody else because they never thought to buy the land. Poor planning. Now, again, as we move forward, our campuses, obviously, we are moving deliberately, seeking to make every step a godly step and a wise step. A little trivia time now for the older crowd. The longest running television show that discontinued in 1975 after 20 years. You can look on the screen for a hint. Gunsmoke. Very good. Now some of you kids, go Google Gunsmoke, okay? Marshall Dillon. But I read about the guy that loved Gunsmoke, and he went to see the place where it was filmed, and he was shocked because when he got there, all that was there was a facade. There literally was just boards propped up by 2x4s. And I think sometimes that's poor leadership, where there's this presentation of something, but there's no depth. There's no reality behind it. And I believe that's what we're talking about. Transparency is one where there's consistency of message and life. And I believe that is what Paul is saying about these 3 men, plus others that he is sending to the church in Corinth. And then that last one is uprightness. Again, both to Timothy and to Titus, Paul talks about overseers or pastors being above reproach, that there's no hint of deceit. And I believe we have the right to hold our leadership, whether they're ministry staff or other leaders in our churches, in our campuses, to be upright as they lead. Again, I would never state from this pulpit a dollar amount that Susie and I would pledge, but I want you to know we feel the weight that we have to be good examples. And so we wrestle. What can we give? How can we give sacrificially? So it's not me saying you all, it's saying we all have to come together before our Holy Father and say, Father, just lead us how to do this as families in His church, in His campus families. As I've said before, and I'll say quite often, that the financial offering will always follow the heart offering. And so are we like these leaders? And we need to be held up to the standard that Paul speaks about with these men that he is about to send. So Paul shows trust in his leaders, Titus and these two unnamed, apparently well-known brethren who are going to take 2 Corinthians and this appeal to that church in Achaia, in the city of Corinth. Well, let's look at the second group as we get to chapter 9, because he turns his focus from the ambassadors, from his envoys, to the recipients, to the believers of Corinth. And Paul trusts the Corinthian believers. He mentions in verse 10 of chapter 8 that they had already been discussing and preparing for this a year earlier, that they had already been wanting to give. He doesn't use the same word begging to give, but there is that preparation. He's going to circle back in verse 2 and again mention that. Let's look at verse 2 of chapter 9. For he continues, for I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the Macedonians, namely, that Achaia has been prepared since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. It's kind of like a mutual admiration society here. He writes to Corinth and says, the Macedonians are awesome. They took up an offering, and they begged to give, and they gave of themselves first. And though they were impoverished, and that word again that's used is destitute, though they're impoverished, they have already gathered their offering. They've sent it to Jerusalem. And now he's saying to Corinth, I have been boasting to the Macedonians about your readiness to give to the gospel. He is saying to both of these different parts of Greece, I applaud you that you are generous of heart, and you're gathering, even though limited in your means, you're gathering those to fulfill that calling to help another part of the body of Christ. Again, the principle there, if you're back on page 94 in your book, it says the people who come ready with the zeal to give compel others. Giving, generosity is contagious. I mean, again, here we are on Mother's Day, and how many times we look back to our moms, whatever age we are, and think about a generous giver of time. Many times in the middle of the night as I watch my own wife with our 5 kids. And just, again, the generosity, I believe it fits well with Mother's Day. Many of you know that we spent most of our adult life overseas. And one of the highlights in our annual calendar was we would gather with other missionaries, sometimes 5 or 6 countries of missionaries, which may be 18, 20, 22 missionaries, sometimes maybe 16, 18 countries. On a rare occasion, all of Europe, we'd have over 1,000 when you count kids, especially in a hotel. And we would rejoice together. We would sing. I mean, we would sing in hotels, and people would come out of their rooms because of just the volume. A lot of times people were so glad to sing in English, having to sing in their second or third languages where they served. But one of the highlights of every one of those meetings is we would have an auction. Our volunteers who would come to do childcare, they would bring what you would consider simple items, Oreos, Dr. Pepper, Diet Dr. Pepper, caramel popcorn. And my kids, right now, they're salivating just hearing me say all of this. And the fun part was they would hold up, and they would sometimes bring like an iPod or iPad or, something electronic that was far more expensive in Europe and usually a worse version of it. And you would see people spend $250 for a 2-liter Dr. Pepper. Like, really? Y'all must have a lot of money. No, I can tell you, missionaries make about half what pastors make. And it was just wanting to give. And more than, I can't even count how many times it would happen where 2 people are bidding, for that. There's a basket with 2 6-packs of Dr. Pepper, 2 caramel popcorns, in 2 Oreo bags. And it's like 300, 350, 400, 450, sold. And that person goes and he gets that basket and he goes to the person that he just outbid. And he says, here, this is for you guys. And he takes out a Dr. Pepper. He says, here, take this. And he gives it to another guy. And of course, early on, I'm like, wait, that's a $50 Dr. Pepper. Wait, go give him a Coke and then, take this with you. But it was the joy of being able to do it. And when I think of joyful giving, that's what I think of. All the money goes to missions, just so you know. And we'd raise over $100,000 with a bunch of impoverished missionaries who were going to give to missions anyway. And yet they could bless other people even as they did it. That's what I think of, how generosity compels others. A lot of times it took people 2 or 3 years before they realized, I'm missing out. And so they would step up and they would want to give and give generously so that others could benefit from that. And when you come to verse 3 of chapter 9, actually the tone changes a bit. And Paul's going to give a warning, and I believe it's worthy of our reading, verses 3 and 4. Because he shifts at the end of verse 2 to say, as I was saying, you may be prepared. Otherwise, if any Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to speak of you, will be put to shame by this confidence. So I thought it necessary to urge the brethren, those that are going to go, that they would go on ahead of you and arrange beforehand your previously promised bountiful gift, so that the same would be ready as a bountiful gift and not affected by covetousness. Do you hear the warning there? Okay, I've been boasting about you to the Macedonians. Please don't let me down. What if we were to come and you've had a change of heart? What if all of a sudden you begin to think of, well, if I give that, then I can't go to Starbucks or whatever they had in Corinth at that time. Or if we give this, what if the crop comes in less than we had hoped? And so there's that warning that they'd made a commitment, but now Paul's just saying, just follow through with that commitment. Now, again, you've seen the commitment card. It's in your book. And there's some people that have already told me, well, why do I have to do that? I don't want to do that. Well, you're not compelled, obviously. I don't have a checklist. I'm not going to follow up and say, you know what, you never gave your card. I'm not going to know. But why do we want this? Well, a couple reasons. One, I believe it helps you. It helps me to prayerfully prepare. It makes me seriously sit down in my situation with my wife and say, honey, what do we feel led to give? And it's a prayer concern. I hope this is on your mirror or somewhere that you would look by your TV remote. I don't know where you look. And you will look and pray and say, Lord, what would you have me give? Secondly, it helps us, what we've been talking about, good planning, preparation, positive steps. It helps us to be responsible even as we walk by faith. One does not rule out the other. And so that's why next Sunday night at the Cross Point at our Bel Air campus, all 3 of our campuses, all 6 of our congregations are going to come together for a worship service. And it's going to be our advanced commitment night, where we're going to put these in a basket. Nobody's going to see them except the bookkeepers who are going to compile them. And it's going to be a time for us to corporately come together. On the following Sunday, the 22nd, for those who can't be there that night, we're going to have a similar service at each of the campuses. And it helps us to follow through with commitments, just as Paul is saying here to the church in Corinth, and to help us to plan well for the commitments that are fulfilled. Let's look again at those verses, and we'll see on that 94th page again the final answer this morning to those questions. It says, leaders who do advanced planning can steward God's resources well. Again, when I attended seminary back in 1983 to 86, we lived in Dallas and we drove back and forth to Fort Worth. Susie finished a 2-year degree. And about that time, there was this really charismatic young pastor who began to attract a lot of people to him. He was fiery and funny and all of that. And he convinced everyone to move out to Rockwall, which is just outside of Dallas. And they built this huge gold-plated, it wasn't real gold, but it was shiny. It was very conspicuous. It was called Church on the Rock. And hundreds began to attend. And they had the blowing and going band. And it was cutting edge back in the 80s. And they began to take out loans so they could build bigger and higher and more exciting. And people just were talking, and he couldn't get enough of himself. And they kept pouring in. And finally, what often happens, is they began to extend far beyond what they could cover. And actually, a friend of mine from Celeste drove an hour to go to this church for a while. And he came back and he said, Pastor, I just can't go back. He said, every Sunday, the message is about giving because we can't even keep up with the interest. He said, last Sunday we took 3 offerings. We couldn't leave until we raised this much money. And you probably know the end of the story. The end of the story is he left. He got another job offer, and he didn't want to be saddled with that debt. And soon after that, the church just sold their property. They couldn't pay the debt. To me, that's the example of not planning well. And that's the example of following a man and not following the Lord. And so again, we need to be generous. We need to be wise. All of these things Paul is telling us to walk by biblical principles, sound financial decisions, walk by faith, and yet walk in wisdom. I'm going to show you a picture up on the screen of a subway. Anybody recognize that subway? You might be surprised to know Cincinnati, Ohio has a subway. It's never opened. It was built, ground was broken in 1900. And for 30 years, they began to build, and they worked on this subway. Over 2 miles of subway tracks were laid in Cincinnati, Ohio. The Great Depression hit, 1929, 1930, and nothing's been done since then. It's sometimes called the subway to nowhere. To me, this is the picture of poor stewardship, of poor planning, and those who do not walk in the wisdom of the Lord. What we're seeking to do together, going deep so we can go wide, is to see God's kingdom expand, not underground where no one can go, but throughout the city, throughout the nation, throughout the world, where it's about His kingdom, and His kingdom will expand. And I want us to listen to a couple couples as they share part of their generosity journey with us, and then I'll close.